in lots of ways. And some of it was the times we were very unpolished, but God used us in spite of that. One of many reasons I appreciate the church is that they actually are the ones who gave me the opportunity to learn the art of ministry, and I'm still learning.
All right, guys, welcome back to episode 3 of this current series, in which is actually episode 42 of Door Church Connect. If you're keeping score at home, we are going to jump back in with Pastor Warner and Pastor Garett and be talking about the epic ride to Tucson, Arizona.
All right, so we left you last week laying in the hospital in Phoenix and Good Samaritan Hospital, going through your rehab, if you will, your various experience with that. What I'd like to cut to now is what I think is a master class in leadership example that Pastor Mitchell, as he kind of set the tone moving forward, and no doubt you had a part in that in your response to this whole thing. But I just imagine that something like this happens. You start into the church planting venture. You have so many different people and how they process things. You know, they everybody processes things different. Pastor Campbell said a couple of weeks ago on a podcast here, it's not what happens to you in life, it's how you process things that matters. And so I imagine, and I've heard stories of people in the church there in Prescott thinking, this is God telling us church planting is it shouldn't happen. There was no doubt Pastor Mitchell must have faced resistance. And then you have the other people on the other side going, the devil's a liar and he's not going to win. What was, from your recollection, from your reflections, what was Pastor Mitchell's response? We hear the legend of him standing up in church and making a declaration about this. What are your earliest recollections of that?
Yeah, well, some of this is not legend. This is actual reality. And it's more than a master class in leadership. It really, because we have the privilege of looking back, 45 years.
I was going to say, don't say 2020, but yeah.
Yeah,
right.
No. So the vision is established that we're called to win souls, to make disciples, and then to plant churches. So we are launched. I have my accident, so this would have been 1 week later, on a Monday. So this wasn't like Pastor Mitchell had weeks to think about, to ponder. This is coming in rapid fire succession.
Right.
Is that word gets out very quickly. Harold's had an accident. He's paralyzed. And all of the things you mentioned were a reality, which is people questioning, is this really what God wants us to do? Because how could it be God if the first step that you make is an epic failure? Right. How could it be God if Harold is paralyzed or in a wheelchair? And there were some who were vocal in their opposition, but their opposition was rooted in other things. This just became an opportunity for them to express their discontent and use me as an example. And so I'm injured on Monday. They've done surgery. In Prescott, life goes on, which is a whole other reality that no matter what happens, life just keeps moving on. And so they come to their Wednesday night sermon service. Pastor Mitchell gives the news of what has happened. And he did, at the end of that service, he didn't, it wasn't Hollywood, like, bombastic, the devil is a liar, but it was just in his way and his stature, saying, what we're doing is of God. This vision is of God. And just because this has happened, we're not going to let it stop what God has for us as a church. We weren't a fellowship yet. We were just a local church. And at the end, he did give a call. How many young men are willing tonight to go on record that you will take Harold's place? Because obviously I'm going to be sidelined for an unknown period of time. And I have to look at my research notes, but there were, I believe, 16 men that night who stood up and publicly acknowledged that I'm called to preach the gospel, and I'll take his place. I'll present my body a living sacrifice to do God's will. And he did issue that challenge. And I, for one, am forever grateful that he didn't back down.
Yes,
he didn't cave to pressure. He didn't, he didn't have a crossroads of doubt that maybe we shouldn't be doing this. He didn't collapse, but he just gave a clear challenge that this is the direction that God has for us, and we're going to keep doing it. And so as I said, am forever grateful for that stand. I look back, having been, around a long time, and I see that as I was going to say unbelievable, but kind of a breathtaking kind of tipping point. Is, yes, things could have gone in a different direction, but he said, no, this is who we are. This is the vision that God has given us. And I think that the seeds of our steadfastness were planted by him that night in his response and the overall church's response.
Right.
And again, anyone who vocalized any kind of opposition, they weren't the majority, but you'll always have that. But
you could just see this. Biblically speaking, what the devil meant for evil. To destroy something, God turns around and uses it as a catalyst to bring things together, to make everyone come together on the same page and say, no, we're going to do this.
Yeah.
And he's trying to destroy it, and it's actually making the movement stronger, which we're looking at 50 years looking backwards, going almost 3,000 churches around the world as a result that started in that Wednesday night service with 16 men standing up and saying, no, we're not going to let this deter us from what God has put in our hearts.
That is not legend. That is actual fact. And I
mean that because I look at Pastor Mitchell, yourself, as legends.
Yeah. Well, I just mean it's not fictional. It's not let's embellish. It was one of those things you didn't have to embellish. It was what it was.
What it was, yeah.
And so that's a fantastic thing.
It was legend. It wasn't myth, but it is legend. So you have the opportunity to come and start your own ministry. We asked the question, why Prescott? So I'm going to ask the question, why Tucson? How did you get here?
Well, when I got out of the hospital, I was an inpatient for 3 months. And then the final month, I was an outpatient. I would make visits down to Good Sam Hospital on I can't remember how regular basis, but it was during that time. So if I was in the hospital May, June, July, August would have been the outpatient season. And so sometime almost exactly in that period, Pastor Mitchell asked me to preach a Sunday night service. And I remember it. I don't remember what I preached. It was not memorable. But I remember because I was still wearing, I had to wear for that month a back brace. Very uncomfortable, horribly uncomfortable, but I had to wear that. And so I preached that Sunday night. And then, I just participated in the life of the church. And so that was in September. Sometime in October, November, the Foursquare headquarters, whether regional or, well, it had to originate in LA, but regional, spoke to Pastor Mitchell that there was a little Spanish-speaking mission in Tucson. It was called Mission Evangelica, and there was a Spanish-speaking ministry there, building, and the pastor had died. His wife inherited the small remains of whatever was there, couldn't manage it, didn't feel that was her place or her calling, had contacted Foursquare headquarters. They, in turn, it might have been John Holland, but contacted Pastor Mitchell that there essentially is a building or an opportunity. I don't know if they had to sell it, that it was more than it really was, but my desire to preach the gospel hadn't changed. And so, which is remarkable to me, that there was something greater than myself taking place. And so Pastor Mitchell, like he did in the beginning, since then, the church had planted another church in Wickenburg. They had planted another church in Flagstaff. So I had been the first, Mona and I, the first couple sent out. Accident occurred, and so now we are number 3. In that he came to me, he told me there's an opportunity. He didn't try to oversell it, but I said, yes, let's give it a try. And so we drove down to Prescott, from Prescott to Tucson. The motel has a different name, but it's a motel on Drachman, right north of Speedway. Stayed there. And that very night, I remember, we went down to the south side of Tucson, Veterans Boulevard, and found the building, this old, somewhat broken down, stuccoed building. And Mona and I were on the exploration trip. This is dark, at night down on Veterans Boulevard. It was fairly dark. It wasn't well lit. There were some people hanging around. I asked Mona to get because it was in the trunk, to get my wheelchair so I could go check out things. She wasn't at the time, and I don't blame her. She wasn't a fan of getting out in a darkened area of south. I said west side earlier. I think south side.
Yeah, but her bio instincts were kicking in. Is that was happening? Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. And so
the Pena blood was flowing.
Yeah.
And that's what it was. It was a building. Next to it was a dirt lot, and then it just so happened that right next to it was a duplex apartment. So the building was 125 West Veterans Boulevard, the apartment, and it was available to rent, which was actually kind of strategic, that I had to just wheel, from my house to the church. I think it was 111 West Veterans Boulevard, which we rented. And then in all of the preparations, there's an old TV show called Have Gun Will Travel. And so, have pulpit, will preach. And I do remember that Greg Johnson came down and he built the altar benches for me, because if you're going to preach, it's with the anticipation that there will be people. And, if we're going to give altar calls, opportunity for people to pray. And so he made these benches. I remember the black Naugahyde material over the foam rubber and the wooden, so they would be there at an angle. I'd be in the middle with my pulpit. The only bad thing is the bathroom was behind me. And so there were services where people had to get up and walk past me while I'm preaching to use the...
Nobody has ever experienced that while pioneering before.
To use the restroom.
There are no sermons in that story.
Yeah. And so that, our first service was December 16th, 19...
Wait. So December
1973.
So April 30th, you get in a car accident,
May 1st,
break your back.
Yeah.
And then December 16th. So we're talking, 7 months?
8 months, yeah.
8 months?
May, June, July, August, September, October. Yeah, 8 months.
8 months.
So 4 of them were in the hospital, more or less. And so, this... but again, you got to keep in mind, this is a season. I might have had an accident, but the world goes on.
Yep.
God's still moving.
Yes. There's still opportunities.
There's still opportunities. Nothing had changed except that, if the curb was a little too high, I'd need a little help. Coming down, gravity is your friend. And so I could bounce over curbs, and all of the tricks that I picked up to function in a wheelchair, but those opportunities were still there. And so that became the beginning of the Tucson church in the South Side, Veterans Boulevard. As things begin to grow and people started getting saved, we actually then rented out the other section of this building because it was a duplex, knocked the wall down. We had people come down from Prescott to help, knock the wall down, enlarge that building, change the pulpit around so that people weren't having to walk past me all the time while I was preaching to use the restroom. And when that building was filled is when we constructed our own facility right next to the old adobe building. In fact, there was a door between the brand new building that was 3,200 square feet and then the old adobe section. There was a door between the two buildings, ironically very similar to what we're building today, although there won't be a door adjacent, there'll be a little walkway. So it was very similar, and as people started getting saved, that building started to fill up, and it was what a amazing experience that there were many services where people had to sit on the floor, just like when I was first saved in the Prescott Church, even in this now larger facility. And many of your relatives and uncles were sitting on that floor of that building worshiping God, and all that God began to do. So it's a real miracle.
Let me step back a little bit, just from my own experience and the drive of what's happening in the atmosphere of the church and around the world. I mean, as a fellowship, Pastor Mitchell's now starting to talk about overseas, which is like Mexico.
Yeah.
And I mean, this is getting big. And so let me ask you a question. I don't think I've ever asked this to you before. Why did you stay in Tucson? Were there struggles you had at times, that urges to go overseas, to plant another church, to do something else? It's rare that a man stays in the same congregation and successfully pastors for almost 50 years. And why did you stay? Why?
One thing is, I've always tried in my heart to say, God, I'm available for whatever you have. And, I've had wild hair ideas. I could do this or I could do that. Two things probably are the major features, though, is that the quality of people that were getting saved were likewise being discipled, were looking for opportunities to share the gospel. They were getting married. Families were starting. Is that I do believe that there was a special connection, or there were special bonds that were established, and there came a greater sense of responsibility, not just, for me, but then when we started planning churches, responsibility and oversight, capacity for those churches. So that was the major one. And then, on the practical side of things, I'd learned how to live life and function optimally, even though I was disabled. And there is a comfort factor, not in a wrong sense, but there was in a familiar sense that I think was there, that to try to move to another city, another country, and to normalize things there, Yeah. So I'm sure that figured in the back of my mind. But I have always tried to say, God, my life is not my own, whatever you have, but it's the pastoral linkage to people and now to other pastors and churches begin to grow in a very significant and in a very deep way, that I felt that, God, that is my role. That is what you have for me. Right. And so those other opportunities, maybe they weren't off the table, but they were shoved to the side.
Yeah, I just know sitting, like so many pastors can testify. You're sitting in a conference and they're talking about, and it just boils. I want to go. Yeah. I want to go. And all these opportunities, and and then having gone and experienced revival in Tucson, and various things. God could do this again somewhere else, but I think that's very critical. Those elements of not just the practical, but the reality that the quality of people that God was raising up necessitated a growing leader to oversee them and to develop them into leaders themselves. Now,
and they were doing what I could have done, and I put that in quotes. I'm not being presumptuous. So in a sense, they were doing what I would have done, but they are the agency that God is using in those different areas and cities. And like you said, their own growth and maturation started happening and becoming very, very visible.
So I can't go, but they can go.
Send.
I can send, and they become an extension of
Absolutely.
my ministry, which is discipleship, which we'll get into the final episodes. But let me just break away a little bit here as well, because I think when I'm looking at the Tucson church, one of the things that I'm so grateful for, and having the privilege of ministering alongside of you for many years in different capacities, I look at the strength of the Tucson church, and so much of it is these next generation kids that they're not kids anymore. They're 30, 40 somethings. They're having children, and they love the church. I mean, they love to be a part of our church. They're pillars in their own rights, and they're in their 30s and 40s, and they're having kids, and they're raising families, and they're the part of the church. And I reflect back upon your emphasis, and one of the keys I think that God did and stirred in your heart was the focus on children's ministry, and then it later became youth ministry with Paula Valley, Ed Gutierrez, various people through the. But there was, and you were always enabling that. Was that something that was just instinctive? Was it just there's a need and we need to meet this? And obviously people presenting things to you. But I mean, I'm looking now 50 years later at our church. It's so healthy with all these young people and young established couples that are generational church, that love to be there, that want to be there, that are ministers in their own right, incredibly, and doing amazing things for God. And I'm thinking, man, there was an emphasis that you placed on not just children's ministry, but then youth ministry as it evolved as the kids got older. How did that develop?
Yeah, well, and you know that it's actually one of Pastor Mitchell's saying that ministry and success is finding a need and filling it. So my part of things is just identifying where there is need, and then secondly, how can we meet that? And so as the congregation begin to grow, people start getting married, then they start having children. So that need was very, very obvious that, wait a minute, they're going to need attention and ministry. And so much of what God has enabled me to do is essentially say yes to, number one, the existing need, and number two, to people who step forward and say, hey, I feel I want to be a part of, or I want to do this. It's a joy, in a sense, to just say yes to a lot of things that turned out to be the hand of God.
Yes.
So whether it was children's ministry, next generation ministry, and all the young people who went through that, who were ministered to, whether it's, the ladies' Bible study, they, to this day, want to give me all this credit. All I did was say, yes, that's a good idea. If you're going to make this a Bible-centered gathering, not let's share your frustration publicly.
Yeah.
No, this was all, I just said yes to a lot of things that God was doing.
So was it like a policy of yes, or was it just more of a posture of yes, where you kind of just let it ride and you had to find out what happened after that?
Yeah, it was a posture. There was no policy except that, it has to flow with our overall vision of winning souls and making disciples. There's just the combination of God bringing the right people. And I am a strong proponent that out of the local church, all the things that are necessary for the sustaining and the growing of life and ministry is raised up out of that, is that God, whether it's Garett's father, Frank and Susan King, the Unruhs, who had a burden to minister to children, Arlene, and her desire for women to study the Bible, whether it's seeing the need, because kids grow, life goes on, and now you have teenagers, you have to minister to them. So that principle of finding a need and filling it has been the story of our church's whole existence.
And I think it's what makes our church so strong and unique. Sometimes people walk into a 50-year-old church and they're expecting an old church. And you don't get that when you come into our church. I've invited people to church and tell them it's almost 50 years old, and they're like, at what context? Normally I'm expecting to see all these gray hairs, but what's so beautiful about our church is the gray hairs are still there.
Right.
But their kids are ministering, their grandkids are getting ministered to, they're starting to have great grandkids, and it's like this unity between the generations. It's not an us versus them, it's a we need each other to move this thing forward. And it's such a healthy posture in a congregation to come in and I think along with that, not just the development of that, but our continued focus on evangelism and the freshness of souls, and that God is changing. And it's not this religious, just generational. It's this people coming in that are getting gloriously saved today like they did 50 years ago.
It's Book of Acts model where Peter said, your young men shall see visions, your old men shall dream dreams, and I'm going to pour out my spirit upon all flesh, and your sons, your daughters shall prophesy. And so it is the combination of young men seeing vision, old men dreaming dreams that has that generational aspect to it, but it's talking about the life of Jesus Christ in his body, which is the church.
Yes.
And, the thing about life is that you can't create it, but you can just simply release it and direct it, and hope then that people start making right decisions along the way that further their lives, their families, their futures.
When you reflect back on the first 5 years of pioneering, revival covers a multitude of mistakes.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so would you uncover some mistakes you made?
Yeah,
maybe?
So I read those notes and I put question mark, mistakes?
Mistakes?
And so the human brain has an amazing capacity, at least mine, to selective memory and to forget all of the mistakes. On a personal, and I was talking to, I think it was Steve Pinnock the other day about this, is that one mistake, and it is a mistake, is not clearly understanding the difference between men and women. And so, the hunter-gatherer, warrior aspect to men, the nurturing aspect to women, is that, there was a desire in me to preach the gospel, to want to see God breathe on people and people to experience Christ. I'm running off to win the world, but not forgetful that, my wife isn't necessarily thinking along the lines of world evangelism and taking the world for Jesus, which is easy to say. It's another thing to actually do, and not being sensitive to those basic differences between men and women, expecting your wife to have the same drive. Sarah followed Abraham, but it wasn't, the same drive. And so recognizing the difference, I'm sure that because Jesus said it is impossible that offenses will come, that I, in the process of youth and ignorance, probably offended numerous people along the way. One of many reasons I appreciate the church is that they actually are the ones who gave me the opportunity to learn the art of ministry. And I'm still learning, but they were the ones who gave me that opportunity because in lots of ways, and some of it was the times, we were very unpolished, but God used us in spite of that. And so, my greatest mistakes and or disappointments would be people who, for whatever reason, are no longer running the race. And if that was due in part to my lack of wisdom in how I handled things, it's very hard to go back and relive things, because the reality in pastoring is you can't make people's decisions for them.
Right.
That's why, the absurdity of there was that season where they wanted to refer to cultish activities that were going on down at the door. Well, first of all, they'd never been there. They don't know. But secondly, is you cannot make people's decisions for them. All you can do is help guide and shepherd them, and then learning the difference between leading the sheep and trying to drive them. There is a big difference. You can drive goats, but you can only lead sheep. And so it's easy to mix up the two and think that leadership is somehow you being given authority to drive people. No. Leadership authority is given to serve and then to lead by example and to then be with people in every imaginable experience of life. And so that distinction had to be learned over many, many years.
Yeah, I remember a conference video years ago when evangelist Larry Beauregard was doing them at the time, and you were asked a question, what's the hardest part about pastoring the same church for, I think at the time it was 35 years. And I think, to paraphrase you, if I did, is that you said something to the effect of you have to live with your mistakes. And, at that time I didn't know you'd ever made any mistakes. And so that was quite shocking to me. I thought I was the only one that made mistakes, but it just always resonated in my heart, as we're working with people and we're trying to do the best we can to help them in their future. It's so sensitive. Things weigh in the balance, and God has to get involved, and He gets involved when our wisdom is at work that He's deposited in us, and He also gets involved in our mistakes to bring people back around and to help them, because He's more into this than we are.
Yeah, and it's recognizing God again. I didn't build this.
Yep.
You did. These are your people. They belong to you, which is a sacred and a heavy responsibility, but also knowing that, wait a minute, God really is involved in people's lives, and there are many mistakes, but there are also many memories of God intervening and
Yes.
getting involved in people's lives, even with my bumbling and stumbling. They're making right decisions that keep them, headed in the right direction. So that's just how my mind works, and that is I'm far more cognizant of the good things
Yes.
than I am, the bad things.
Philippians 4 has trained us in that thinking.
Yes, it has. And
So the church is, thriving. Things are happening. People are sitting on the floor. All of his uncles are there in line. When did church planting start happening in Tucson? Do you remember the year? Do you remember the circumstances, the needs that were presented? What was the atmosphere that launched that in our own congregation?
Well, because that was already our DNA, that we had been sent from Prescott, then it wasn't something that we had to concoct on our own. It's already been established, and that is we had the desire to want to reproduce what had birthed our congregation. And so I believe the first, and I have a real problem with dates, but it was, I believe, 1976 when we sent a couple into Clifton and Morenci. And actually, full disclosure, I think it was Kim and Josie Pensinger. But at the time, Kim was single. So I think he's probably the only single disciple that we planted. He was in the process of, the relationship was there, but he went to Clifton before he got married. And then that was the first church planting venture. And, Clifton and Morenci is a very small town. There's not a lot happening there, but some of our greatest ministers and leaders have served in Clifton and Morenci.
Yep.
It's really a phenomenal thing, and to this day. And so whether it was Kim and Josie in the very beginning, now you have Chris and Stacy that are there, who are, young and fresh and excited. And I'm thinking, look at that. It's come full circle.
Yes.
So that was the first. Then Larry and Susan Beauregard went into Douglas, another border town. It was while Larry was there, and he can tell it much better than I can, that he wasn't having necessarily great success in Douglas, but where he did have success is across the border in Agua Prieta. Went over there, prayed for a family's child that was sick. God healed the child, and out of that, there was a worker sent from Mexico to take over that church, and the church in Agua Prieta began to grow and thrive. And then it just started to grow, and the momentum of discipleship and people who stepped forward and said, you know what, God has called me. We don't twist arms. I don't sit there and say, well, you're going to go here, you're going to go there. It's people responding to what God is doing, preparing themselves, making decisions that will give a priority to this. And then our church or congregational role is to be agents and help to send them.
What were some of the First Nations? I mean, obviously, Agua Prieta is Mexico, right? So what came after that internationally?
Well, this is going to challenge my timeline. You have Marty Carnegie, who went into Jamaica. You had Paul and Renee Stevens, who went into London. And then the other...
Argentina?
Yeah, there was Argentina and Spain. I think those were the first 4 international. And then Sierra Leone. But we're going to have to get a church historian, maybe bring them on staff, at least temporarily, to give us...
Get the story straight.
It actually would be great,
beautiful.
wouldn't it?
Yeah.
To have some kind of mural that gave the specific timeline.
That's a feature in our new building. Michael's taking note right now.
A mural that gave the timeline of people and nations and cities.
Oh, yeah, that'd be beautiful.
That would be, and we haven't got that far in the design process of, right now, the distinction is the flags flying through the building. Maybe that is sacred, I don't know, but that would be a great...
Are you talking about like a fresco on the roof?
Yeah. Wouldn't that
on
be
the ceiling,
fantastic?
Pastor, to be honest with you, I'm trying to pick out bathroom stalls right now. So it's a little...
Well, I'm trying to stretch. See, that's my role, is to stretch, to start throwing out these big ideas.
We got Michelangelo on the phone. And
I just need to know what faucet to get, because people are going to analyze and overanalyze it,
So we've been sending out churches for 45 years. Has anything changed in the church planting process? Have we learned anything? Have we changed anything? How is that differ? How does it differ now from 1976?
Well, there's a couple of probably major distinctions, and one is the vocational pastor who is working a job and also pioneering a church. And there are a lot of reasons behind that. Some dictated by individual cities and opportunities. So you have that feature. You have, because when I was sent out, I remember the plan in place at the time is I received $1,000 of support, and that was cut in every quarter. So every 3 months, they deducted $250. At the time, I got a little stipend from the Social Security Department because I was disabled. I don't know what happened to that, if they forgot. I don't get it anymore. But you have that element. You have the other element of redirection, which is a new aspect. And that's simply a reality of life, and that is not every venture is a guaranteed success story.
And you were the first man ever redirected in our fellowship.
I was. And so I know both the pioneering side and then coming home side, even if it was abbreviated. But trying to give dignity to any returning worker, which is you're not a failure at all. You are a hero, or you are a great success because you said, I'm going to throw my hat into the ring.
Yes.
I'm going to get involved. So in returning, to give dignity, and also then to give continued opportunity, because the story of their life and the chapters are not over. So over the years, I've had to, and others on staff have, God help us to do a good job when it comes to returning workers, that, if there's a need for healing, God, let them be healed and prepared to be sent back into battle if that's their desire. And so that's an aspect that we've had to learn. The international aspect has always been a stretching element, because you're in different countries, different cultures that have their own unique challenges. So it causes you to continually pray, God, build your church. Lord, the harvest is plenteous, but the laborers are few. Pray the Lord of the harvest that he send forth laborers. And so I am always referring, God, you're the Lord of the harvest. God, give us the workers and the means by which we can continue to reach out.
Well, I think that that's an excellent place to end this episode, because our next couple of episodes are going to be for those pastors out there, disciples, leaders. We're going to be boring into Pastor Warner's mind on leadership issues, and it's going to involve a number of things, from the local congregation to church planting, international works, and we're going to get into those aspects of things coming up in the next couple of weeks of episodes before we conclude this season with one final episode that we're looking forward to. So, Gabe, why don't you take us out?
All right, guys, you know the drill. Like and subscribe, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube. Tell your friends and family, and we will see you again next week as things get even more interesting with Pastor Garett and Pastor Warner on Door Church Connect.